Welcome back. Really is. Brighter? Yeah, brighter. Here we go. Okay. So, yeah. We're going to be continuing on with Abolition for the People series. Today's essay is written by Dean Spade. Dean Spade is a scholar, an academic, a lawyer, a writer, has even done video documentaries focused on queer and trans liberation based in racial and economic justice. He's got 2 years of... Yeah, chicken hat. Yeah, I like my chicken hat. He's written such books as Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law. And his video documentary is Pinkwashing Exposed, Seattle Fights Back. Another book, which I believe was recently published, Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next. All very good subjects. Yeah, chicken. Little beak. Chicken hat. So, this article is... The last essay that we covered was kind of through the lens of understanding restorative justice and such, as well as the anti-native native and indigenous acts of police. This is more through the lens of queer and trans. Yeah, well, in the Discord I have kind of books and resources recommendations. I try to post up some books. I'll be posting some of these titles to the books channel there. A lot of these folks that have contributed to this essay series have created some really good literature. The essays just scratch the surface. It's just these really are just entry points for much more in-depth and thorough discussions. But you have to start somewhere, so. Anyway, let's get into it. Good. It's all working still. Rainbow washing's true colors. First of all, what is rainbow washing? Just as a term, it is actually a term of what is truly virtue signaling, like corporate virtue signaling out there, and in this case, police virtue signaling, where they adopt symbology, pretending as if they are advocates and allies for a particular cause, in this case, the LGBT community. But it is in contradiction to their actions. So, rainbow washing, it's like trying to cleanse your image through symbology. The Queer and Trans Fight for Liberation and Abolition by Dean Spade. In recent years, more and more police departments have rolled out rainbow-painted cop cars for Pride, safe place campaigns with rainbow cop shield stickers and other messaging that portrays cops as pro-LGBT. Is this progress? Are the police a positive force for queer and trans well-being? Queer and trans activists have a long history of protesting against police violence. In fact, annual Pride celebrations mark the anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion. In June 1969, at a bar called the Stonewall Inn in New York City, queer and trans people fought back against the ongoing violence they faced at the hands of police. For a long time, queer and trans people, especially Black and Indigenous people and other of color, have been some of the leading activists in movements for police and prison abolition, such as Angela Davis, Miss Major, Andrea Ritchie, Adrienne Marie Brown, Angus, Alyssa Bierria, Angelica Chazaro, Tourmaline, and Beth Ritchie. Some of these names we've heard from in this very series. And yeah, that's actually something that sometimes gets overlooked by people who aren't really involved actively with advocacy and such as, you know, Pride, the Pride celebrations, the whole annual Pride marches and such. That wasn't just because it was a fun time. That it came on the heels of a really violent struggle. You know, the Stonewall Rebellion led to other movements, but yeah, that was the kind of keystone one. And as we keep seeing, any social progress only comes when active resistance to the state is significant enough. It's never just because the state decides, oh, well, you can do X now, or you can exist as a such and such person now. They never seem to make those compromises peacefully, and yet they demand only peaceful protest in response, because that's easy to ignore. Anyway, in the half-century since Stonewall, much has changed for queer and trans people. Social norms, media representations, and some laws have reduced the stigma associated with our communities. However, poverty, housing insecurity, discrimination, and violence are all still a reality for queer and trans people, especially trans people of color, queer and trans immigrants, and queer and trans people with disabilities. Unfortunately, police harassment and violence, as well as the brutal violence in prisons, jails, and detention centers, remain a central source of harm for queer and trans people. This is touching briefly on some of the things that Mona discussed a couple weeks ago on Trans Day of Visibility. How laws are set up to encourage police harassment and violence against trans people and queer people. And just to have excuses to arrest them. For these reasons, many queer and trans activists have rightfully pushed back on law enforcement's new pro-LGBT branding. Grand marshals and awardees at Pride celebrations have withdrawn in opposition to police participation at Pride. Protesters have blocked police contingents and created alternative events rejecting the idea that police are all LGBT friendly and should be part of Pride celebrations. The fight over whether police belong in the annual celebrations that mark the anniversary of fighting back against the NYPD at Stonewall are but a sliver of the broader work queer and trans people are doing to abolish police, prisons, and borders. Why is abolition so important to queer and trans resistance? And why have queer and trans people and communities been leaders and visionary in the fight for abolition? First, because queer and trans people have been and remain targets of the police. 48% of LGBTQ people responding to the National Crime Victimization Survey report experiencing report experiencing police misconduct. Sorry, I was reading the different form of report there. Other studies have shown that trans people are nearly 4 times more likely than cisgender people to experience police violence, and 7 times more likely to experience physical violence when interacting with the police. I'm going to repeat that phrase. Other studies have shown that trans people are nearly 4 times more likely than cisgender people to experience police violence, and 7 times more likely to experience physical violence when interacting with the police. I want to pause there because I want to push against the idea. I know most of this community isn't buy into it really, but it's a really important thing to keep in mind that laws are not applied equally. Law is not blind. The justice system is not indifferent to who you are. It very much cares who you are, and certain people are to be harassed, attacked, and arrested at higher rates because the state and the tool of state violence, that is policing, carry out what they perceive as their duty to kind of purify society of what they deem undesirables. Like, the data backs this up. This is not just conjecture or just me ragging on police because it's fashionable to do so. The data demonstrates this time and again. And we've just seen it again with Duante Wright. Like, if the data didn't show it, it wouldn't be claimed. It would just be like, maybe we would just say police are generally violent, which they are, but they're especially violent against certain groups of people, and that has to be highlighted. It can't be ignored. This violence is even more severe and targeted for Black and Latinx trans people. According to the National Center for Transgender Equality, 38% of Black trans people report having been harassed by police, 15% report having been assaulted by police, while 16% of all trans people are involved in underground economies or criminalized work like sex work to survive. 34% of all Latinx trans people and 53% of all Black trans people are involved. And for these people, police violence levels are even higher. And, why does this happen? Hey, AJ. Thanks for dropping by. Hope your workday is going well. Yeah, and why does this happen? Like, this is the same thing as that Monaji mentioned, where, sure, on paper, it's not allowed for employers to discriminate, but they do. Against, trans people, and especially against trans people who are either Latin or, Black. And if they can't get work, they're gonna fall to whatever kind of work they can do, survive. And like, let's be honest about it. The real reason why sex work is illegal isn't out of any moral objection. The real reason is because we want to criminalize being poor, and we want to make certain communities or in this country so that we can arrest them, use them as slave labor. Like, that's, the machinery is there. There's not a valid case for keeping sex work criminal. Police profiling and targeting, as well as reduced pathways to citizenship through family, due to widespread family rejection, means queer and trans migrants are more likely to be undocumented and get swept up in detention and deportation proceedings. In juvenile jails, adult jails, and prisons, and immigration prisons, queer and trans prisoners are targeted for violence and have an increased likelihood of solitary confinement. Our communities live with the stories of Tony McDale, Laylene Polanco, Patrice Johnson, Renata Hill, Cece McDonald, Kai Peterson, Johanna Medina Leon, Roxana Hernandez, and many others. Queer and trans people who have died in ICE custody, were killed by police, or were criminalized for defending themselves. We don't trust the police. We fear them. Also, I realized belatedly I didn't post this essay's URL to this chat. If you want to follow along, and if you want to follow any of these links, feel free to. Second, queer and trans people fight for abolition because we refuse to have our movement for liberation co-opted by law enforcement as a public relations strategy. Hundreds of cities have adopted the police-initiated Safe Place campaign since it was invented in 2014 by Officer Jim Ritter at the East Precinct of the Seattle Police Department. Ritter created the pro-SPD propaganda campaign 4 years after Seattle erupted in protests over the police killing of native woodcarver John T. Williams, and 3 years after the Department of Justice launched an investigation of the SPD that found systemic use of force violations and bias. The Safe Place campaign encourages businesses to put up a rainbow police shield sticker in their windows to let anyone fleeing anti-LGBT attacks know that if they come inside, the business will call the cops for them. Like rainbow-painted cop cars, the Safe Place logo takes a symbol of the queer and trans liberation movement, the rainbow flag, and puts it on a police badge to declare that the police are our protectors. But the police are leading perpetrators of violence against queer and trans people, not our protectors. Instead, we want businesses to agree not to call the police as a way to make our communities safer. We don't want our lives and the violence we experience used to legitimize the police or expand their ever-growing budgets in our names. This is the same Seattle Police Department that had all kinds of shit go down through 2020, mind you. They definitely are not anyone's ally. Well, they're the state's ally and their capital's ally. Not real people. The third reason queer and trans resistance is tied up with abolishing prisons, police, and borders is that our movement emerged from and is completely intertwined with movements for racial and economic justice and against colonialism worldwide. The uprising at Stonewall happened in the context of widespread resistance to policing in the United States and to war and colonialism globally. Queer and trans liberation is inextricable from other leftist liberation movements. Feminism, migrant justice, black liberation, disability justice, and more. All marginalized and targeted groups face not only poverty and housing insecurity, but also police violence and targeted criminalization and deportation. All of these movements imagine another world where all people have what they need. No one is exploited to enrich others, and we don't live with a violent, standing army of police endangering our lives and using resources that could be better put towards housing, healthcare, and childcare. Because, yeah. I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here. Because this is rolling around a concept that's been really sticking in my head lately. This concept of targeted criminalization, right? Like, it is, of course, just them preying on marginalized communities, and yes, there is the like get people into private prisons for slave labor, and there is the social aspect, but it's even a little bit more insidious than that. Like, just to describe how baked into the system it is, I want you to imagine like your own department at your company or something, right? You have a budget, and are there many circumstances where your department, where you're working, would demonstrate in a report to the higher ups that, oh, we're shooting way under budget, we're super efficient, we could cut back, we don't need as many workers or resources right now? No. I mean, nobody does that. Capitalism and the ideas of how business operates and how money gets moved around under this system necessitate that every organization, no matter what it does, constantly grows if it can. Uses up more resources, such. And the same is true of police departments. Like, they have to justify their own budgets and their personnel and the constant expansion of power that they're calling for. And the way they do that is by creating work for themselves. Like, a lot of these laws, you know, the victimless laws and such, or victimless crime laws and such, a lot of these anti-homeless things that get carried out, all of these movements by police are done to you know, sap their budget and to demonstrate that yes, they're still needed. You'll almost never see falling crime rate because police can't allow that to happen. They will create crime out of thin air if they have to demonstrate that they're still needed, because they are financially incentivized to do so. It's a requirement. It's a that's how rigidly baked into that system it is. Because could you imagine if they're sitting there pulling in these tens of millions of dollars and just tons more resources than any other agency in the city, and they put out a report that says, yeah, crime's way down. Everything's fine. People are at peace. You know, arrests are extremely low because we've started actually just treating people fairly and actually addressing problems. The answer to that is, well, you don't need that many people and you don't need that many resources, and we're going to cut your budget. I'm not saying that as like sympathy for the police. It's just that's the reality of it from a purely pragmatic capital gamesmanship perspective, that's what they have to keep doing if that's their current system. Right. Right. Well, that's the argument that they make. But they also never allow crime to go down. If they ever start to, they start criminalizing more things or start finding weird esoteric laws that they can use to make arrests in. Like, you never see a significant drop in crime, no matter what laws get passed. Because they can't allow it. Never going off on that tangent, it's just, it's a line of thinking that's been really rolling around in my head a lot lately. Or we were down here. Okay. For decades, we have watched as police budgets and the number of people locked up have grown. A 2017 study showed that Oakland spent 41% of the city's general fund on policing that year, and Minneapolis spent almost 36%, Houston 35%, Chicago nearly 39%. Many of us live in cities where more than half the budget goes to policing people, processing them through the courts, locking them up, forcing them into electronic monitoring or mandatory services or other forms of racist control. Reminds me of the scene of The Office where Oscar explains the budget surplus problem to Michael. Exactly, Zeri. That's exactly it. Like, unironically, that is a perfect example of it. You can't have a budget surplus. You have to expend it, and you have to justify your position. Capital demands it. And so police are just responding to that incentive. There's a lot of other factors that cause them to be a systemically corrupt organization, but that's the financial aspect. They have every financial incentive to be shitty, and to make arrests where none need made, and to be violent where no violence is needed. They're literally paid to do so. It is their job. And if they are not those things, if they are not acting in that way, and if they are not making these, completely targeted arrests and harassment and such, they may lose their job. I think that's a good thing, but obviously they're going to look after their own self-interest. But that's the problem. Their self-interest is diametrically opposed to everyone else's. And that manifests in violence. Often, police and prison expansions have happened in the name of fixing or reforming purportedly broken systems. They've hired cops of color, women cops, even LGBT cops. They've added training. They've created countless police policies prohibiting police violence. They've created special cages for vulnerable groups. Each reform adds more cops, more cells, or more dollars to a system that is devouring our communities. We're abolitionists because we know it is not a broken system that needs to be fixed. It is a system operating exactly as it was designed to operate, and hurting the people it has always hurt, and it needs to be dismantled. We want to see police, ICE, courts, and cages defunded so that everyone has a safe place to stay, food on the table, and healthcare. It is entirely achievable, and it is the only pathway to real safety for queer and trans people and everyone. Exactly. If they're not making arrests, writing tickets, etc., then their metrics show they aren't doing their job, and they'll get fired. Yeah, exactly, Donnie. Yeah. Yes, Mona, abolish the police. Now. 100%. So yeah, I 300% agree that police have no place in Pride celebrations. or in any celebration or rally by a marginalized community, because they're the ones doing the marginalizing. And they are literally paid to do it. It's baked into every paycheck they receive and every budget negotiation they. Can't reform your way out of this one. Sure, do things, pass laws, whatever in the meantime as a measure of harm reduction. Like, I'm not gonna say reject the good while pursuing the perfect, but at the same time, never stop fighting. Like, this shit has to stop, and the only way it's gonna stop is by tearing that system of policing down and actually building something from the community level driven by people and incentivized to fulfill people's needs. That's the way out of... That's the way that you actually resolve crime and stuff. Not any of this. We keep adding more and more cops to the street. We keep arming them more and more. Crime has not significantly been impacted at any point. Adding cops actually made people more safe. The data would show that. It does not. It just doesn't. So, are there other thoughts on Rainbow Washing's True Colors? Part 11 of Abolition for the People. And by the way, for anyone who is newish to the stream, I'm covering this series of essays put together by Kaepernick Publishing. It's a series of 30 essays. We're covering one per week. It is the case for police abolition, so past videos are on my YouTube and in my Twitch as highlights. The police need better training. Giving them more money, yep. Yeah, not only is there zero evidence that training prevents police brutality, but, like, we just had a case up in New York where the city of New York passed a law strictly forbidding cops from using the same type of hold that was used on George Floyd. So, less than a year later, we have another high-profile case. A cop crouched on some guy's neck. Of course, it was a black person. They thankfully survived, but they don't care about the laws, and in fact, despite every effort being made, no charges are actually being held against that cop. Expressly against the law, the city passed such a law, but not only do the cops not care, but they cannot be held accountable. We had one cop retire somewhat recently, or not, was fired somewhat recently for pepper spraying a black member of the military in the face. Of course, the only reason that a cop will ever be punished is if they actually accidentally attack someone in the military. Because that's like that's who they worship, right? We had another case, like I said, Duante Wright, 20-year-old man shot. The woman officer claimed that she thought it was a taser. And my answer there is, maybe they shouldn't be having guns if they don't know what a gun is. I mean, there's a lot of reasons they shouldn't have guns, but certainly that's a real obvious one. Someone who lived close to Camden, they stripped down a very corrupt, remove the union. Yeah, Camden is a very interesting case, and is a decent model where a lot of things could be learned from. It's certainly a starting place. They did seem to kind of rebuild something like a police force. It still carries all the trappings of a police, but the mission seems to be very different. But I'm skeptical that it'll hold. And keeping an eye on it. Because that's right. It's kind of the same problem fundamentally as I was talking about, is over time there still is a financial incentive for them to expand their power and what they are, the policing side of that is directly involved in. Until you get rid of that, then every police department will always gravitate towards expanding its power and contracting any social programs or anything that cuts away from them hiring more people, buying more equipment, and setting up more programs that they oversee. So, we'll see. And yeah, Donnie, exactly. A lot of this stuff it takes forever for stuff to come to light when cops are doing things and but yeah, like prisons, they're like, they objectively just do harm. What kind of model do we want? Well, like last week we talked through some of the modeling after how Native communities for a very long time have had internal restorative justice systems just within their communities. That is the most useful model. Restorative justice, support programs, things of that nature. Like, if you want to address harm within the community, you have to address what's causing people to act out and help them, give them an avenue back to coexisting with that community in a healthy and productive way. And replaced with, well, like I'm talking about, social programs, social safety nets, rehabilitation programs. In the instances of, like, violent questions or violence and such, much violence is driven by people who end up feeling desperate and end up being convinced to blame someone for that desperation. And there's way better ways of addressing that than just throwing someone in a box. Right. And there are lessons to be learned in that, Eppolite. But I'm not convinced that it's a solution that will last. Like there's which country is it? One of the Scandinavian countries. They do everything they can not to arrest people, but when they are forced to, because the person is just so they are so antisocial that they are like continue patterns of violence or whatever, they do put them into what technically is kind of a jail, but it's more of like a gated community where they work with someone and with the community in there to try and become a better, more functional person. They get an education. They're allowed. Yeah, it's really more of yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly, Homesteader. Yeah, and there is, I forget which country it is, but there is a country that currently has been doing that, and it has worked extremely well. And they have taken people that, like, this country would just have locked up forever, and within 5 years, they're able to turn them into someone who is able to coexist in broader society and is able to release them. Like, that should be the goal, right? Norway. Yes, Norway. Yeah, that's what I was. That's where I heard about it. Was there is a TV special interviews and such about that. And they used to have prisons like we have here, but they transitioned to that model, and it's completely changed the way that they handle things. Doing that also disincentivizes making arrests. Like, in America, departments are paid to make arrests. There is a whole business around it. But when your entire goal is to try and keep people out of that, yeah, we do. They're woefully underutilized compared to everything else. And, like, I don't want to downplay what happened in Camden. Compared to the rest of America, it's a step. And, like, we will probably need those transitional steps to get to where we need to go. So I don't want to say that it's, not... Like I said, I don't want to throw out the good in pursuit of the perfect, but we do need those stepping stones, but we need to also not give up on the fight. Keep asking for more with every gain that we get. Yeah. Yeah, I really was blown by that statistic that that trans people, I mean, it shouldn't surprise me, but it still does when I read it, that trans people are 7 times more likely to experience physical violence at the hands of police than white people, or than cisgendered people. And yeah, there are different parts of the country where things are a little bit better, but the statistics bear out that cops just aren't the friend of the marginalized. So. But yeah, this was a very good. I had, for what it's worth, I had benign interactions with police. I wouldn't say wonderful. Up until I started actually, you know, joining in protests and things. Because it doesn't matter that I'm white, cisgendered male. I stand like in a BLM line, and I got tear gassed with the rest of them, you know? Jeez. Yeah, and like I said, I'm glad that the community cops in your area are a more benign force than elsewhere in the nation, but I would remain aware of the financial incentives that they have and the social pressures that they have, or the political pressures that they have, to expand their power and act out. And of course, you know, I continue to be an abolitionist, so I'm biased in that respect. That's good. And some are individually fine. Some are individually decent people. I'm not going to sit and judge what is in the heart of hearts of every cop. What I will say is the system, the structure of policing is, it incentivizes the wrong things and it focuses on the wrong missions. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And it really does. It's not just the rehiring, it's also just the entire goal is wrong. Yeah. But I'm going to shift off of this essay, and let's go ahead and say farewell for now to Dean Spade. This was a really good read.